Welcome to Perspectives on the Church. I'm joined today by Dr. Ian Jones from the Saltley Trust, which is a Christian education charity based in the West Midlands region, covers Lichfield Diocese as well as several others. It's ecumenical. And Saltley Trust supports projects in Christian discipleship and the church's work in education. Ian, welcome.
Hello, thank you. Thanks for having me.
Ian, from your perspective at the Saltley Trust, what do you think the biggest challenge facing the church is at the moment?
I guess just answering that totally personally, I think probably with a few notable exceptions, I think probably in some ways the biggest challenges facing the church at the moment are also some of the biggest challenges facing the world at the moment, actually. Because although obviously we kind of have a hope of heaven, actually kind of God makes us as kind of creatures of the earth as well. So in that sense, I think we're kind of totally bound up with some of the challenges that we're all facing at the moment. I could list tons, couldn't I? Obviously recovering from the pandemic. I think there's real issues around making good work, kind of creating good work for people to do, healing a kind of fractured society. I guess the one that I'm thinking most about is the kind of climate and nature crisis, really. It feels like we've kind of got so much out of balance, really. I don't know if you've come across something called Earth Hour, where it's the day in the year when we've kind of used up the Earth's resources that can sustainably be kind of got within a year. And I think last year Earth Hour was on the 22nd of August or something like that. So we'd already kind of used a world's worth of resources by 2/3 of the way through the year. So we're kind of overstretching ourselves as a kind of planet, really. And I guess the thing is we can kind of see that as one issue amongst many, but actually the climate scientist Catherine Hayhower, who's also a Christian, she always says that the climate crisis is a kind of threat multiplier. So anything else we want to do as church, when we want to share the good news with other people, when we want to love other people practically through a food bank or something like that, any of those kinds of things all get made more difficult if we're not addressing that kind of 101 question of, are we looking after the world that God's given us? So I guess for me, that's the really big one that I'm kind of thinking a lot about, and it's as much a challenge for the church as it is for the world. I said with a few notable exceptions, the kind of issues for the church and the world feel like the same thing. I guess one of the challenges I think a lot about from the kind of for the church specifically is, we're used to saying that our faith is good news, gospel means good news. But I wonder how many people in sort of Western society, particularly around us, think of the Christian faith as good news. Do many people feel that it's actually old news or even bad news? So I wonder, that feels like a big challenge to me, is how we address that and how we help people through what we say, but also what we do, kind of receive and hear the message of Jesus as good news. So I think there's some stuff there around how we learn to kind of communicate that well, but also how we listen well, and how we sort of hear where people are coming from, I think, as well. So I think ultimately, both of those things actually probably come down to the same thing, actually, in the sense that kind of Jesus says, doesn't he, seek first the kingdom of God, and all these other things will be added. So how, I guess, are we kind of seeking God in all of this to start with? Kind of has to be, that feels to me like the kind of number one challenge. You know, are we continuing to kind of seek God in all of this? Do we know our faith as good news in ourselves? And how does that then overflow into the way that we live our lives? So it's kind of a question about discipleship fundamentally, all of those things. I guess I'd like to kind of bring some of those things kind of back into the core of who we are and what the kind of being and doing of being a Christian actually is. So we don't see these things as kind of issues to crack, but actually that they're kind of fundamental about who we are. You know, are we loving the earth as God wants us to? Are we learning to kind of share the good news in a way that people can hear it?
That's pretty interesting. So is that a way of saying that even if there wasn't, say, a climate crisis, our disposition towards the world, the earth, creation, is still probably not at the moment what a disciple might expect?
I think, yeah, I think I probably am saying that, and in saying so, I'm talking to myself as much as anybody else. You know, I'm not, yeah. So yeah, I think there is something I really like. William Temple, who was Archbishop of Canterbury during the Second World War, talks about how kind of when we've got our relationship to God and our relationship to others and our relationship to the earth kind of in sync, things kind of work really well. But if one of those is kind of out of kilter, it kind of affects the others as well. And I mean, personally, I find that quite helpful to actually think, you know, how am I kind of trying to line those things up and making sure that I'm kind of living in a way which God wants. And yeah, totally, I've got a long way to go in that, as we all have. But you know, I guess that's what I'm aiming at. Yeah.
So a lot of people won't know this, but you and I worked together at the Saltley Trust for 3 years. One of the conversations that we used to have a lot was, what do we mean by the word discipleship? And if I kind of want to just invite you to say something unchallenged about that, if you kind of see that now as central to the response of all of those things that, I mean, like, must keep you up at night sometimes, that you listed at the start of the conversation. What would you say now?
Yeah. So I guess we use the word discipleship or disciple as a really technical term sometimes, you know, in kind of churchy conversations. And, you know, I know that, you know, for some people, the idea of being a disciple is quite scary because, you know, we're not like the 12 who were gathered around Jesus in the New Testament. So I couldn't possibly be a disciple, or maybe I would be one day. But for me, I guess it's just about the kind of being and doing of life with God. And I think both bits are important. You know, it's the Rowan Williams talks, doesn't he, about following and abiding are two things that Jesus talks a lot about. And I quite like that, actually. The idea that some of it is just sitting, you know, with God, is just being at rest and kind of tuning ourselves into God. And sometimes it's about stepping out and doing stuff. So it's about that process of kind of learning as we follow, just the being and doing of all of life with God, really, not with a sort of, we do God on Sunday and we don't do God during the week, but actually, you know, the whole package, just being kind of having a kind of posture of being open and attentive to God and what God might be doing, really. trying to respond. Yeah.
Do you think or expect to see the church changing around discipleship?
I think it's always changing. So we should kind of always expect something new. I think I'm quite hopeful about some of the work that's being done at the moment around everyday faith, and really kind of embedding that sense of actually this is about the whole of life. It's not just the kind of the religious bit or the spiritual bit, but that actually everything we do in our family, community, work, social, and church settings is all part of the picture, and it all kind of connects together in some way. One of the kind of really good things I enjoyed us doing at Saltley Trust was the Christians in Practice project, you know, talking about how people connect their Christian being and doing, their discipleship, with the way in which they volunteered in their communities. And so I guess that's all part of the picture, I think.
Thank you. I wonder what you think, what resources you think the church has for facing into some of this at a time when it's easy for the church to think, well, we're getting smaller, we're getting less significant. As an institution, at least, we can feel under threat.
Yes. I mean, without wanting to kind of play down the challenges at all, I think we've got massive resources at our disposal. I mean, obviously, I think our biggest resource in all of this is God. It's easy for that to be a kind of pat answer, and maybe an even better way of putting it would actually be that that maybe we're some of God's resources. I don't know, but I think kind of somewhere along the line, I think if God isn't our kind of chief resource in this, we're probably doing something wrong. To go back to Temple again, I really like that thing he talks about prayer and coincidence, and you know, Temple talks about you know, people say answered prayers just a matter of coincidence, and he says, well, the coincidences happen more often when I pray. And I'd kind of almost want to flip that around for me sometimes and say, well, I keep messing up, but actually I mess up less often when I pray about it, sort of thing. So there's something about just kind of totally relying on God in all of this. I think there's each other as well. I mean, you know, you said, you know, numerically about the churches in Britain being in decline, but actually, you know, the numbers of Christians in this country, people who sort of would actively take their faith seriously, would number in the millions. That's actually quite a big organisation to be part of, and maybe one of the challenges actually is kind of us kind of learning to rely on each other, seeing each other as resources in all of this, not trying to do it all ourselves. I don't know. I suppose the other thing is that there's I would struggle to think of a time in history which has been more blessed in terms of the kind of rich resources of wisdom we have available to us, actually, in developing as Christian disciples. You know, I mean, your average medieval monastery maybe had a couple of hundred books, if at least. You know, we have 2,000 years worth of wisdom on living the Christian life, and you know, apps, YouTube channels, blogs, you know, all sorts of ways in which we can get in touch with each other. You know, so if you want to learn to pray, you know, and you know, you don't feel that your church is systematically or intentionally helping you learn to pray, I mean, yeah, go and batter down your vicar's door and ask them to pray. But actually, if nobody's helping you, there's loads of stuff out there. I think in terms of resourcing, at least, we don't have any particular, most of us anyway, don't have any particular grounds to say that we don't have anything at our disposal. So yeah, I think our resources are huge in this respect.
One last question, slightly more personal one. What gives you hope for the church?
Yeah, I think in all of this, particularly the kind of challenges of the last year, I think one of the things that gives me hope is that sort of sense that across history there's a kind of an unfolding plan here, that God has not forgotten us, and that the church has been through really hard times in different places at different times in history, you know, for most of the last 2000 years. We're kind of promised, you know, do not fear, for I have overcome the world. Nothing can separate us from the love of God. You know, some of those really kind of timeless promises that we read in the New Testament. And sometimes, you know, I mean, when hard stuff happens, I guess this is where the rubber hits the road with some of these promises, isn't it? That we might feel like we're only clinging on to them by our fingernails. But, you know, that's the time to cling on sort of even harder. But I kind of think it's not just sort of pious hope, actually, that you can see sort of throughout history how, you know, it's looked at certain times in certain places like the church was a goner. And, you know, if you think about, you know, 5th century Britain, and you think about the kind of the Anglo-Saxon invasions and things like that, pretty much the church in the British Isles is kind of pushed back to the very margins. And yet, you know, if you look 100 to 200 years later, actually the kind of Christian culture of Anglo-Saxon England is incredibly rich, and we still read some of that stuff today. We still have a huge debt to some of that stuff. I hope, you know, I think we could learn a lot more probably from places where churches have experienced persecution or hard times around the world. But also, you know, I think even very contemporary, I mean, anecdotally, I hear people saying a lot that actually where churches are finding kind of creative ways to engage with their communities during lockdown, actually those churches are doing pretty well, actually. And it's maybe the ones that haven't found that way of engaging which are finding things harder at the moment. And I was talking to a friend actually the other day who has a friend who was doing some research on churches in Japan during the earthquake about 10 years ago, I think it was now. The kind of Christian community in Japan is really much smaller proportionately than it is in Britain. But one of the interesting things that a lot of those churches did was that they got involved when the earthquake struck, but also that they stayed involved. So when the kind of the agencies, the aid agencies and the government agencies pulled back from some of those communities, those churches got involved. And I understand that actually that's really helped in terms of the, you know, bring new sense of new life and purpose to those churches in Japan, but also their kind of how people see them in the community is a lot more positive. There's apparently, you know, in some places, you know, the local Christians are known as Mr. Christ and Mrs. Christ, which I think is just lovely because they, you know, and I mean, you know, whatever else I do or don't achieve in life, if somebody could say that about me at the end of my life, I'd be totally you know, that would be like a major win for me. So, you know, there's all of that. And I kind of think in all of this that it's very easy to focus on the challenges. It's easy to be daunted by the challenges, I think, isn't it? And I feel daunted or worried about, I'm a natural worrier, as you know, so I will worry about all sorts of things all the time. But it kind of strikes me that actually the people I see stepping out and doing something amazing, even in a very small way, just putting faith into practice, often experience huge joy and fulfillment in doing so. And, you know, something like the climate crisis, I mean, looking after the earth is great, actually, isn't it? You know, many of us have been outdoors a lot more during the pandemic, and actually, isn't it great to realize, you know, what a great planet we live on, and you know, how wonderful nature is and how great it is when we're just taking part and looking after it. So, you know, there is a cost to discipleship. You know, Bonhoeffer talks about the cost of discipleship, doesn't he? That's the kind of way his book's often translated into English. But actually, I really like, I think it was Dallas Willard talks about the cost of non-discipleship. You know, what do we miss out on by not stepping out? And I'm speaking again to myself here as much as anyone else. You know, I could step out a lot more than I do, I'm sure. But actually, I think that's really true, that what are we missing if we don't?
Well, thank you, Ian. You've sort of taken us around the whole world, back the 2000 centuries, and shared a bit of your own spirit and soul as well. That's been a fascinating conversation. Great to be talking to you again after a couple of years away. So thanks for joining us today.
Oh, it's been great to do. Thank you very much.
All the best.
Cheers.